Hi, everyone. I'm sorry that it took me a few minutes to get into the meeting. For some reason, it wouldn't accept me right off the bat, but I'm here now. And I think it is my role as the moderator to introduce our speaker, Robin Collins, who has a long history as a activist on nuclear issues and promoter of the abolition of nuclear weapons in the international system. As a lead figure in Canadian Pugwash, and we've collaborated in various other ways with him through Science for Peace. I don't want to give him too long of an introduction because I know he has a lot to say about our current topic. So let me pass things on as quickly as possible to Robin Collins for his contribution to considering the current risks of escalation in the context of the conflict in Ukraine.
Hi, am I heard?
You are.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Arndt. My presentation, I figured, is about 20 minutes. So I'm going to try and talk at a reasonable pace. But I do have, there's a lot of material that could be discussed, and I'm narrowing it down to a lot of material that is, I think, relevant to the question. So the question, the topic of the hour is there a increased risk of nuclear war as a result of the Ukraine war? Sorry, of nuclear war as a result of the Ukraine war. I could give the simple answer of yes, and then we could depart. But I'm going to be a little more detailed than that. The reason is that there are some more complicated questions that pop up, including absent nuclear weapons in this picture, would Putin have invaded in the first place? And also, did nuclear weapons in Russia's possession prevent NATO and others from intervening directly? In other words, did nuclear weapons deter? So these are questions wrapped up into the question about risk of nuclear war. But we need to explore, I think, the longer answer to the title, which is, well, the shorter answer to the title is yes, the Ukraine invasion has increased the unacceptable odds. But the baseline, that is the pre-Ukraine invasion situation, was also unacceptable, that being reliance on nuclear deterrence. And another question is, are there better security arrangements and guarantees available? What are they, and how would they be put into place? Since the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists began using the Doomsday Clock quite some time ago now, they have more recently combined the risk of nuclear war, which was sort of the original framework for the clock, with climate change. And as a result, this makes it a little more difficult to assess what the risk baseline is if you're relying entirely on the Doomsday Clock. But even before climate disruption was added into the mix, and even before the current invasion and Ukraine's military response, the Doomsday Clock was already perilously close to midnight. Midnight being the point where lights go out for the planet. It was 7 minutes to midnight in 1947. I think this was the first year of the clock. It was 2 minutes in 1953, moved back to 12 minutes in 1963 following the entry of the Limited Test Ban Treaty. It was 17 minutes in 1991 at the end of the old Cold War. But it's been creeping up ever since, until in 2020, when it reached 100 seconds before midnight.
Hello, I'm in the meeting.
where it had sat for some
No,
time.
you get up.
And it reflected at that point in time, 2020, the crises of irregular nuclear war threats, the COVID.
We just lost Robin for some reason.
Okay, I'm back. I'm not sure where I left off.
It was just 2 seconds ago.
Okay, that's good. You've missed hardly anything. The clock was reset January 20th of last year, just before the Russian invasion. It was 100 seconds before midnight. As of this year in January, we're at 90 seconds. The point I'm making here is the idea of threat and risk are not particularly objective nor agreed measures. It's true that 70,000 warheads are more dangerous than the current 12,500 warheads, but numbers are not the only one of several risk elements. And you can effectively destroy the Earth's capacity to sustain humanity with a fraction of the total in today's much reduced arsenals. As they say, the gold standard of nuclear war risk reduction is zero nuclear weapons, that is, abolition. In one study in 2018, a few years ago, it was called a pragmatic safety limit. It was argued that only 100 Hiroshima-sized weapons, which are small compared to what's available now, which on average are 5 to 25 times larger, only 100 of the Hiroshima-sized weapons could cause global mass starvation due to nuclear winter. You wouldn't die from radiation, but or at least most people wouldn't die from the radiation, but from the graying out of the sun and subsequent global agricultural failure. Risk assessments are also based on a changing global political situation, the state of mental health of leaders, the kind of conflict where nuclear powers are or are not at play, among many other factors. So I'll focus now on two things. One, the baseline threat of a nuclear incident possibly leading to nuclear war, and the present change in threat due to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I think we can comfortably say that the current risk of nuclear war is raised because of the Ukraine war, simply because there are nuclear weapon states involved directly or indirectly in the current killing, and they are issuing nuclear threats, be they direct, guarded, or implied. Although I think it has to be said that the American side has been remarkably careful, relatively speaking. They are sticking to supplying conventional weapons for the moment. I'm also not sure we can say this nuclear crisis is the worst ever, and worse even than during the Cuban standoff in 1963, as some have said. Doesn't much matter. We know we did get out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we know how, as a result eventually of cool-headed risk assessment, eventual or mostly sober leadership, and mostly backroom dealing. So let's begin with the normal baseline risk of nuclear war. Calculating the risk of accidental or unintended nuclear war due to misinterpreted data is a highly theoretical and tentative exercise. Any risk of a global nuclear holocaust or a regional nuclear war must necessarily be brought to zero quickly and forever. It's the baseline risk because there have been nuclear weapons in existence since 1945. There were 20,000 by 1963, and the majority are in the hands of two states, the USA and the USSR, now Russia, many at launch on warning or launch under attack status. Or I shouldn't say many of the total, but quite a few are at that status. However, some of the other smaller nuclear weapon states may be seen as more volatile, less stable, more likely to launch. And that's another debate. But let's focus on accidental launch by Russia and the USA. There's a recent effort by forecaster Peter Wildeford, May of last year, who argues that the chance of nuclear war happening by accident is going down. Based on his not unreasonable calculations and assumptions, he proposes there's a 2 to 6% chance there being an accidental nuclear exchange sometime in the next decade. Others have estimated 9%. The probability of an exchange resulting in an all-out nuclear war is another set of predictions. But also, he suggests, the longer we go without nuclear war, the more evidence we have that nuclear war is less likely. Now, I'm not sure that that's true. I think our sense of security being based on a non-event is insufficient evidence, although we do that all the time. Our late colleague, Alan Phillips, many of you would know him, at least by name. He was with Science for Peace, and he was with Physicians for Global for Global Survival. Physicians for Global Survival, now IPPNW Canada. Alan did some back of the envelope calculations 20 years ago when I interviewed him about launch on warning policy. In the context of an accidental, unintentional nuclear exchange, Alan said at the time that, here, this is mostly a quote, the fact that it hasn't happened in 40 years, now that would be 60 years, is remarkable. And some people, including General Lee Butler, have said it is miraculous. Well, that's a word I don't think Alan used very much, but it does suggest, he went on, but it doesn't prove that the probability isn't high. But you cannot calculate the actual probability of an entirely random, unexpected type of accident that may be completely unforeseen. However, he said, if you take that risk of 1% of disasters per year for 30 years, it comes out to this, that the world has a 3 to 1 chance of surviving, a 1 in 4 chance of disaster. Now that's bad. It's not so bad as an even chance, but it's not the sort of thing one should accept. If you take a revolver and hold it to your head and have one chamber loaded, as in Russian roulette, and you pull the trigger once, you have a 1 in 6 chance of death. You have 5 to 1 chance of surviving. That is safer than what the Americans did, on my assumption, which, as I said, I believe is conservative. Then you have the equal or greater risk of the Russians making the mistake. So that would be like 2 pulls on the trigger. That was our friend Alan Phillips in 2003. Now to the primary subject of this discussion, which you're probably wondering when I'm going to get to, the question of, is there a heightened risk of nuclear war because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine? There is a greater risk due to the Russian invasion and subsequent Ukraine-Russia war, but also because of the unexpected resilience of the Ukrainian defense, now bolstered with Western and NATO military aid to Ukraine. Not only are these factors additional to the baseline risk, but they might exacerbate risk with miscalculations or misreadings that could result from the tensions of the war and the fog of war. On the other hand, those watching their radar screens may be more careful than ever. Then there would be less likely to be a wrong assessment and that they'd go launch. They might be more likely to use tackler nuclear weapons with smaller yields, however. We should also ask ourselves who the they are in this conversation. But for the first time in a long time, at least one nuclear weapon state has made overt threats to use nuclear weapons. For example, in September last year, Putin said he wasn't afraid to, quote, use all the means available to us, end quote, and that he wasn't bluffing. Last month, Russia deployed or stated they were about to deploy nuclear missiles to their ally, Belarus. Its leader, Alexander Lukashenko, in power now for 29 years, seemed to boast about receiving them. In late February of this year, according to Reuters, Putin told the West that Russia cannot be defeated. He suspended participation in the New START nuclear arms treaty and claimed to have put new strategic nuclear weapons on combat duty. But he also referred to the legitimate use, this is in quotes, legitimate use of nuclear weapons in the event of an existential threat to the survival of the Russian state. Simply because this was said at all, it can be interpreted as Putin establishing justification or pretext for use of nuclear weapons in order to prepare the domestic population for expanded warfare, or more likely perhaps, to seem to not be bluffing in the eyes of NATO. The Russian red lines now include use of conventional weapons against the Russian Federation, where the very existence of the state is threatened, or, these are quotes, attacks against critical government or military sites of the Russian Federation, destruction of which would undermine nuclear forces' responsiveness. Given the declaration that Crimea and segments of the Donbass and the East have been annexed, declared Russian territory, or at least independent of Ukraine, this implies Ukrainian reoccupation or reassertion of sovereignty will cross one of those red lines that could be subject to nuclear weapon use. At the same time, this seems or feels highly unlikely. The most likely, perhaps the only scenario where he would intentionally launch is if Putin felt he would possibly lose the war. His presidency was undermined, and out of desperation, he launched without any sane consideration of the consequences. I'm going to give 3 optimistic points, although they're a little bit tainted. Number 1, an optimistic point. Having made these points above, we should not exaggerate the risk or fall into despair. For one reason, there is a nuclear stalemate of sorts. We know this partly because there are not millions of people in the streets who think a nuclear war is imminent or even likely, even now. Maybe they should be in the streets, but they aren't. The risk may be unacceptable at any level, but it can also be relatively low, even if higher than in 1962. A positive November 2022 statement published on the Russian Foreign Ministry website stated that, quote, Russia is strictly and consistently guided by the tenet that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That nuclear doctrine is unambiguous, and that pursuing solely defensive goals is the goal and does not allow for expansive interpretation. Then the statement appealed for talks about security guarantees that Russia had demanded of NATO before it invaded Ukraine. Side by side with this more positive in tone statement late last year, there had been a long list of aggressive postures, which I won't read. I'll just show you. There's a list of some of them, all from Russian officials, including Putin and Medvedev. Seymour Hersh recently referred to, some of you may have seen this statement, referred to statements by Sergei Karaganov, chairman of the Russian Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, who is said to be close to Putin. Karaganov said, quote, we will have to make nuclear deterrence a convincing argument again by lowering the threshold for use of nuclear weapons, now set unacceptably high, and by rapidly but prudently moving up the deterrence escalation ladder. He continued, the enemy must know that we are ready to deliver a preemptive strike in retaliation for all of its current and past acts of aggression in order to prevent a slide into global thermonuclear war. It's an odd excuse for use of nuclear weapons. But morally, he continued, this is a terrible choice, as we will use God's weapon, thus dooming ourselves to grave spiritual losses. But if we do not do this, not only Russia can die, but most likely the entire human civilization will cease to exist. So he just said this, quoted by Seymour Hersh. The point here is that the rhetoric raises the tone or expectation of risk, even if not the actual risk itself. It is impossible to know how real these warnings and threats are. Are these the ramblings of irrational actors? Or are they saying, we really mean this, we really, really mean this, that kind of rhetoric? We know that the official US and NATO rhetoric on the nuclear weapons front has mostly been more restrained than Russia's. We also know that the loudest voices may be the ones more likely to be on the verge of compromise. They train baseball umpires, we are told, such that the more unsure you are, the louder you should yell out the ball or called strike. Optimistic point number 2. Things are being done cooperatively by both warring parties. There is some restraint. Nuclear war so far has been deterred. As speakers at a recent Pugwash Canada Peace Table pointed out, prisoner exchanges have been discussed. Grain shipments and safe shipping corridors have been arranged. But neither Russia nor Ukraine, as far as we can tell, are rushing towards a ceasefire or peace negotiations or a demilitarized zone, and positions have hardened as well. Optimistic point number 3, mixed messaging includes peace windows opening up. Among the rhetoric for escalation, there are occasional messages of hope. I mentioned a few before. It should be said that this is normal. It can be an opening, and it can also be phony messaging. Sometimes the response to these openings can be gruff dismissals, but talks continue in the background nevertheless. A couple of days ago, President Putin offered an olive branch. He said, quote, "If you want to see a negotiated solution to the conflict, it's enough for them, that is the US, to stop weapon supplies." He also said, quote, "There are many reasonable people in the US administration who don't want to take it all the way to World War III, in which there will be no winners," end quote. So why might Russia be unlikely to use a nuclear weapon? Here's 3 cases. It would be a breach of the nuclear taboo, for one. The taboo is wobbling, but it still exists. Use would require a failure of nuclear deterrence, which appears to be working so far. And to the extent it possibly enabled the invasion to happen in the first place. Nuclear weapon states, to their discredit, still see nuclear deterrence as a stable form of security. Use would lead to a highly unpredictable outcome for Russia. Certain repercussions from NATO and the US, including expanded war and possible nuclear war that would benefit no one, no state, and that includes Russia. What I meant to say was that there would be certain repercussions, and these might include those. I see no scenario where the US or NATO, assuming rational actors, would launch a nuclear weapon first intentionally. But how do we minimize the risk of this leading to nuclear war? Here's a series of suggestions. 1, lower the rhetoric level. 2, engage in those small victories, including expanding the grain supplies effort, collaboration on prisoner exchanges, protection of nuclear power plants, schools, and hospitals. These are in the interests of both warring parties. 3, acknowledge the other side is making gestures when they are. 4, acknowledge that this war will eventually have to end. 5, each side should publicly recognize its own failings and the devastation of war and its impact on everyone. Justin Trudeau, for example, while in Kiev recently, raised the issue of a democratic deficit in Ukraine. That seems an important concession to have been made. Immediately following Russia's decision to deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, surely at the highest level of escalation by one side so far, the US State Department said, quote, it had no intention of altering its position on strategic nuclear weapons, nor seen any signs that Russia was preparing to use a nuclear weapon, end quote. This is good messaging. I think we're up to 6 here. Continue to say a nuclear war can never be won and nuclear weapons can never be used. 7, peace groups can organize peace tables, as the Canadian Pugwash group did last month at the bequest of the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons in November of last year. So those are some things that can be done in the short term. In the longer term, there are a whole series of measures that need to be taken, and perhaps and now they're more likely to be taken. And these are along the lines of replacement of the current security confrontations with a common security set of arrangements. This is a much longer conversation that we need to be having, and urgently. So to close, we should remind ourselves that already Ukraine has won by preventing Putin's effort to subjugate Ukraine as a client state. And they made it very unlikely that Russia will absorb the Ukraine East comfortably. Serious issues on this front remain, and they will have to be resolved eventually. NATO has expanded. Finland went from 20% supporting joining NATO in 2017 to 78% in favor after the invasion of Ukraine. It is unclear what will happen to Crimea, but we can make guesses. But as our panelists agreed in the Pugwash peace table, the time is not ripe for a ceasefire, let alone a peace agreement, but it might be riper now. However, nuclear weapons are being used, and in this sense, that their very possession so far has prevented or at least inhibited NATO from responding directly to the invader. This has also meant that this war is being allowed to drag on through perpetual supplying of weapons into a kind of bloody stalemate because of the war of escalation regionally, or to nuclear war being a risk. Absent nuclear weapons in this equation and substituted with security guarantees for all, where might we now be instead? And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Robin. That was a very informative presentation, and I think you've hit on some very, very important points. Before turning to questions, and I'm sure there are lots of them, I just wanted to voice my pessimism in this regard, which contrasts a little bit to your optimistic points in the conclusion of your presentation. In particular, that while the deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus is certainly a major escalation and an implicit threat of the use of nuclear weapons, it has not had the effect of Western countries being more inclined toward negotiations. In fact, there are several statements that I've heard that we must not give in to nuclear blackmail and double down in terms of our commitment to Ukraine. That's, of course, all very understandable, and one should certainly not give in to nuclear blackmail. But the portion of that that worries me in particular is that there has been, on the Western side and on the U.S. side, initially a very great reluctance to get sucked into the Ukrainian conflict, and a great reluctance to provide categories of weapons that might be perceived by Russia as signaling NATO involvement. And that reluctance seems to have more and more disappeared. And at the same time, what has increased are the uses of various weapons, not just within Ukraine, but increasingly also within Russian territory. And in that regard, I think that we're on a very, very dangerous and slippery slope toward a kind of escalation that might become uncontrollable. And there's one thing that I wanted you to respond to as well. John Mearsheimer has been very prominent and outspoken in his critiques of the Western positions with regard to this current conflict in Ukraine, and has suggested, has been very pessimistic about the prospects of keeping it non-nuclear, and suggested that eventually it's quite likely that nuclear weapons will be used, but suggested that the most likely scenario for that happening would be that Russia might use a tactical nuclear weapon, not against a NATO country, but within Ukraine itself. And the main reason being that Ukraine, not being a member of NATO, would not immediately result in a kind of a devastating reaction by NATO. But what makes me rather skeptical of that, and I'd love to hear your reaction to it, is one wonders how the West would respond to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And it seems to me fairly certain that some kind of response would be absolutely necessary, or perceived as absolutely necessary. And where that goes is anyone's guess. I think that's a very likely scenario to lead to the greater use of nuclear weapons in other contexts as well. So I'd welcome your response to that.
Great. That's a great set of questions, and I hope I didn't appear to sound too optimistic about options. I was trying to balance all the bad news with the potential windows for opportunities. I mean, I think we could paint the situation extremely bleak right now, but I was trying to sort of pluck the gemstones out of the mud. And much of what you said is about how bad things look, including with respect to Belarus and the some of the language about, you know, NATO or the Ukraine side ramping up its response, you know, firing missiles into Russia itself, and so on. So I don't disagree with your pessimistic side. I'm trying to balance the pessimistic with the realistic optimism that's part of my brain. In terms of I saw something else today that one of our colleagues distributed about the use of tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and I just didn't see a military purpose for that by Russia, other than, you know, this sort of far-fetched perception that this would cause Ukraine to capitulate, when in fact the more likely, as you said, the response would be something, because it was a nuclear weapon, that there would be a NATO or something response. Whether that would be a nuclear response is a completely separate question. And that's the difference between, you know, the perception of whether a response would be necessary or likely, and both of those have to be parsed as well. Like a necessary response, well, maybe what would contribute better to the goals of NATO and or the peace, and would a nuclear weapon be a likely response, even from NATO, even if there was a tactical nuclear weapon used? I mean, there are so many permutations here. It's different. None of us, I think, knows the answer to those questions, and maybe some people in the dark corridors of in Russia and NATO headquarters in the U.S. That have plans for each of these scenarios, and we're not privy to them. But I'm not going to argue what might happen. I don't think anybody here knows what might happen, what will happen. I forget what you said about John Mearsheimer now.
Well, basically, that he thought the most likely scenario for the use of nuclear weapons would be the use of a tactical nuclear weapon,
Yeah, okay.
on the assumption that it's not a direct attack against NATO, and that it might be in the hopes of focusing NATO's attention to the existential threat that this represents, and result in a turn to negotiations or something along those lines.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, the assumption there is that they would use it, and that's his projection or his wild guess. I think some of the language coming out of the Kremlin suggests that they wouldn't do that. But anyway, I mean, I don't know that there's a point in arguing both sides of this, of that particular question, because we don't know. We just don't know.
Well, let me throw the floor open to others that might have questions or comments relating to what's been discussed so far. You can do so by just raising your hand, in which case I can call upon you, and you can then unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask your question. Yes, Harriet, go ahead. Unmute your microphone.
Okay, I guess. I just like to purely technically, tactical nuclear weapons can be used in one of two ways. Either against troops in the field, in which case they're completely unuseful, especially the kind of warfare that's going on in Ukraine right now. A tactical nuclear weapon against spread out troops, as we have in Ukraine, is fundamentally unuseful. The other possible use, of course, is to attack the major cities like Kiev or Odessa. And if that happens, of course, the primary casualties are civilians, not military. So my guess is that no matter whether you assume that Putin is sane or not, he has a general staff that would be very cautious about using tactical nuclear weapons. He has no idea of what the West would do. I don't have any idea of what the West would do. Right now, remember, once upon a time, Ukraine had nuclear weapons. They were given up. Whether the West would now turn over the nuclear weapons to Ukraine, I doubt very much. So if there was a retaliatory nuclear weapons, it would come from NATO, and that's very doubtful, because NATO has means of inflicting comparable harm to Russia without using nuclear weapons. We certainly have the long-range bombers and tactical and ordinary weapons. There's another point that the Russian General Staff has to keep in mind. Ukraine is not that far from the Russian borders. The winds can go both ways. Tactical nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soils doesn't mean that the radioactive harm will be confined to Ukraine. There's a good chance that it will blow over into Russia. Now, so far, at least the Russian civilian population seems to be shrugging their shoulders. But if radioactive clouds start forming over Russia, maybe the Russian people will wake up. We have no way of knowing. But it's not very hopeful right now.
Yeah, I'd add a couple more potential uses for tactical nuclear weapons for those who have the ghastly idea that this would be a good idea. I think they could be used as a demonstration event to show again, we mean it, we really, really mean it. They could be used to target military installations. That would be quite different from Kiev, a population center, and or attacking troops, which may. Yeah, let me just finish. That might be a more vague use of such a thing. But as you noted, the more serious question here is the use of a tactical nuclear weapon could gravely cause, or more likely cause, an escalation to a nuclear war, just in retaliation. That, you know, all bets are off if once the first, no matter how large or how small, nuclear weapon is used by one side or another. This makes things very much more dangerous. So that's another reason why it's less likely to be used, not more likely to be used. But I agree with your points. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, you raised the point that, we really, really mean it. The actual invasion was a demonstration of we really, really mean standing up to NATO. If that,
absolutely
right. Well, that's a good point. But I'm just addressing. There's an interesting sort of phenomenon that's taking place in the use of nuclear weapons. I raised it a couple of times, which is nuclear weapons are kind of out of the picture. They arguably enabled Russia to invade using conventional weapons Ukraine, knowing that NATO was less likely to be involved directly in the war because of a fear of escalation to nuclear war. So NATO arguably was deterred from entering directly, but NATO's access to nuclear weapons through its members would mean also that Russia is less likely to do certain things that might escalate to nuclear war. So there's this sort of mutual deterrence effect going on that enabled the invasion and has prolonged the aggression as well. So I'm just saying that, I'm not saying that there's no war going on. I'm just saying that the nuclear weapons are kind of out of the picture, but at a very, very dangerous, at a danger for use, very dangerous in terms of use, potential use. Gilles, do you want me to call my question there, Arnd? I don't know, maybe Arnd's off. Gilles, can you talk?
Mearsheimer argued that
okay, I'm on mute now. Sorry.
Okay.
The point I was going to ask a bit more from avoiding a nuclear confrontation, and I think we need to look at who may convince Putin not to use nuclear weapon. And I think in that context, I think China understands how serious the situation was if there is a nuclear escalation. So I think we should be working with them to try to get them to convince Putin not to use nuclear weapon.
Yeah, it was said at the Pugwash peace table that the two countries that have the ear of Putin are potentially, well, there's more than two, but certainly China, possibly India, maybe Brazil, maybe Turkey. There's a number of states that could give good advice that Putin may be willing to listen to. But there's also the fact that the Americans being involved at some point is important because they hold so many of the cards in this conflict, and so they're not excluded from being. They're probably excluded from being a safe moderating force, but they can't be excluded from the end of the story. And as Putin said 2 days ago, all the Americans have to do is stop. Well, I think this was an exaggeration. This part is stop shipping arms, and then we'll start negotiating. And that there are good people in the State Department who don't want to go to World War III. So the Americans will be involved for sure, but as interlocutors, maybe China or somebody else.
Sorry, Robin, I was just trying to draw your attention to a comment in the chat room, which stated that Mearsheimer's, which is correct, Mearsheimer's understanding was that Russia would be motivated to use a tactical nuclear weapon on the assumption that this would force the United States to shut the war down. And the way that Mearsheimer explained that is that essentially throughout the Cold War, there was a kind of an understanding among the policymakers on both sides that regional conflicts could escalate, and therefore a very strong tendency to try to shut down those kinds of regional conflicts in that kind of situation.
Yeah, so that's Mearsheimer's realism coming to the top there.
Yeah.
Right. He says, rational actors would behave this way. So the assumption being that the use of a tactical nuclear weapon is a rational activity that has predictable results that he has laid out in terms of how he thinks the response should go. That's a pretty high stakes game, in my opinion.
I totally agree. Barbara, I think you were next, and then John Guilfoyle's had his hand up. Barbara, can you unmute yourself?
No, I can't. Oh, there it is.
There you
Okay.
go.
Um, just a quick question. What about the threat and possible consequences of an accidental weapon falling on a nuclear power plant?
Yeah, that's certainly a risk. I mean, well, if it, I mean, actually, you could split that up. You could say intentional. If you are intentionally bombing a nuclear power plant, then it's not a nuclear bomb, but you're certainly doing nuclear things. The accidental occurrence is would lead to a severe radiation crisis, not to the same scale as a nuclear weapon, but so this was one of the things that, I mean, this is you would think unacceptable to both Russia and Ukraine, given the nuclear power plant of interest is within the region of both countries. So you would think, as some of the peace table people had said, that there might be an opportunity. You would think there would be an opportunity for the two sides to come together to protect the nuclear power plants from this situation. That'd be the advantage of both. And as was being advocated then, this kind of sort of mutual cooperation, even during war, can sow the seeds for more cooperation and potential ceasefire. There's no inherent linkage between doing these small cooperative things and getting to a ceasefire, but there's a possibility that it would have them talking, and then that talking in itself could have gains down the road.
Thank you.
John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm just sort of looking at this from the perspective of a physician. Okay, and you kind of, are either dealing with a symptom or you're going to deal with the underlying illness. And in many ways, the situation in Ukraine, dreadful as it is really an outcome of the level of thinking we have at an international level. And the real risk, I mean, we do have a risk of nuclear war, but we also have a bigger existential risk, which is that the world, at a time when it should be collaborating in an unprecedented manner because of the climate crisis, is on the verge of accelerating a nuclear arms race, the cost of which and the impact of which humanity has never seen. And so I think that, much as, the Doomsday Clock, and I think calculating risk, well, how many angels can you fit on the head of a pin? I mean, the issue I'm interested in is what exactly are we going to do about this confluence of threats, not just nuclear, but climate, population, future conflict on resources? What are the strategies that desperately need to be put in place so that this gets to some level on an agenda now that is totally distracted by this war in Ukraine?
Well, there's some hope that in this mess that there'll be some positive lessons learned. I mean, the world federalist in me says that global threats require global solutions, and the ones you mentioned are the key ones. From pandemic to nuclear war to climate crisis. And so how do we step away from, well, are we going to get the right lessons here? I think some of us have been speculating about positive lessons about the uselessness of nuclear weapons, or actually the problem of nuclear weapons actually enabling conflict because of this sort of self-deterrence problem in the background. But the solution to nuclear deterrence is not hyped up conventional deterrence. For one thing, you can do a heck of a lot of damage with conventional weapons without solving the inherent problem. But also, conventional weapons would lead back into nuclear weapons if you escalated crisis such that you still wanted the most powerful weapon. I mean, somebody would go and build it underground or whatever other detection. I mean, it would be a weird situation where you abolished nuclear weapons and everybody abided by the abolition. In other words, this is the conversation about treaties versus norms, which we could have, but this is a subject of great fascination to me. I'm of the view that the norm is more important than the treaty. And by that, what I mean is what you need to establish is this sort of common security framework. There's elements of it already in existence. There's some of it it came out of the Cold War with Reagan, talking with Gorbachev. Not that Reagan was a common security guy, but the discussions between the powers. What came out of the Helsinki Final Act, which led to the eventually the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the whole. I mean, there's a whole package of elements here about diplomacy and peacekeeping and UNEPs for those of us who support UN Emergency Peace Service. Peace building, prevention, rapid deployment so that crises don't escalate. There's a whole manner of things to do to prevent war and to increase collaboration and cooperation. Are we going to learn from this crisis and from the pandemic and in the necessity to resolve climate change issues, or at least adapt to them? That it cannot be done by nation states on their own. We'd hope that there would be some learning here. We don't know, but be assured that those of us in our camps, mutual and unique, will be working on this common security package. Some of us are working on it right now. We want to update the document that came out back in 2015, I think, to the defense, submitted to the defense update. It was the shift to common security and sustainable peace. That group of 78 Rideau Institute, and I think it was about 9 NGOs that signed on to it. And this is a bit out of date now. It needs to be updated to current terms. And we need to start looking at what this cooperative society needs to be and take a cue from the current crisis.
Doug Roche, you had your hand up at one point. Please do unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself with the button at the lower left of your screen.
Working. Okay. Thank you to Robin for a very fine presentation. I think the best way to avoid the use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war is to slow down the Ukraine war and point toward a ceasefire. Everything indicates at the moment that they're going to end up in a stalemate, and the conditions are getting better for the possibility of negotiations. And there are groups around the world that are certainly moving in this direction, in many countries in the global south to begin with. And secondly, there was a meeting in Vienna a few days ago, a number of people very active in the peace movements in various countries, that not a word of which was, I could see, was reported in the Western media. But there are movements that are ripening to push for some sort of process of negotiations. So my only point here, and the reason I wanted to speak, was that if we could turn our attention as Canadians and as activists in Canada to pushing the Canadian government in various ways that are open to us, to open its mind to the inevitability of negotiations, given what has gone on now, and that itself would be a contribution to alleviating the possibilities of nuclear. I want to strongly support Robin's comments a few moments ago about escalating our attention to common security. Indeed, the whole multilateral regime that we have been aspiring to needs to be pushed, and it's going to be pushed by the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Guterres, when he brings out, and fairly shortly, his new agenda for peace, and that will certainly lay the groundwork. So we in Canada, it seems to me, have to push much harder our government to get off of this automatic affirmation of NATO's continued and militaristic values. We need to find a way to get the government of Canada to play a role that, while modest, would still be consonant with the role that Canada played years ago in developing and strengthening the multilateral system. That's the answer, it seems to me, to ensuring that we will not have nuclear weapons used in the Ukraine war. Thank you.
Yeah, obviously, I absolutely agree with those that sentiment. I mean, I pulled out the comment that Justin Trudeau made while visiting Kiev, which I thought was interesting. The fact that he did raise the issue of the democratic deficit in Ukraine, which was somewhat of a peculiar thing to have heard, given Canada's all-out back Ukraine to victory, no matter what it takes kind of language, which is not conducive to, well, that could be the public image. Going on behind the scenes, we don't really know what's being said, and lots of things are said in the back corridors. But that's what made his comment, I thought, kind of interesting, because it was in the public. But, you know, the getting the Canadian government to step up and sort of do what it has done in the past as a fair moderator and pulling sides together and collaborator and this kind of thing. This has been off message for a number of years now, and it would be great to see it back. To really see Canada back. One of the things that we are doing from that peace table documentation, it's some of you may have seen the video. Go to the Pugwash or the CNNW websites, and you can find the video. There's a short version that's been put together if you don't want to listen to the whole 2 hours. But the report on that is coming out in a few days, and Ernie Regeer's food for thought paper will be out at the same time. And these are both going to the Canadian government. They're calling for Canada to support some of the suggestions or recommendations that came out of the peace table, including supporting these sort of incrementalist, small cooperative efforts. And then there's some broader ones recommended. Ernie has quite a few suggestions in his food for thought paper. But we also mentioned the broader security agenda that needs to be relooked at, and security guarantees and so on. This is more of the common security. I don't know if we actually called it that, but that's definitely what we were inclining them towards. So what can we do as organizations and activists on this front? We can develop, I would say, on the nuclear weapons front, and I utterly agree with what Doug just said. The most important thing to be done on the nuclear weapons front right now is to end this war. It's really nothing else. I mean, all these other things that we do, they can be done, but the focus has to be on ending this war and getting there as soon as possible. And whatever we can do to encourage the Canadian government to help in that regards, that's what we must be doing. I think that would be my bottom line message there.
Well, thank you, Robin. I think that's a very good summation. Given that I don't see any hands up, it might be a good place for us to bring our discussion to an end, since we've reached the hour of 6:01 and are right within our intended schedule. But I don't want to shortchange anyone that still has questions to ask, so please do raise your hand if you do. Yes, Greg.
Here's going to be the tough question, I bet.
Hopefully not that tough, but I really appreciate what you're saying, Robin, about how we need to pressure our government to act toward negotiation, diplomacy, compromise. I must say I've written my MP about 3-4 times requesting that he bring this forward to the PM, to bring it forward to the Liberal Party, and I get no response. And regrettably, whenever I call my MP to talk about peace issues, I'm dismissed. I'm treated as persona non grata. Penetrating our political leadership, I find, as a Canadian citizen, I'm really insignificant. I don't count. And my voice is not heard. And in fact, if I call for peace, I'm considered a Putin apologist.
Yeah.
I'm considered a traitor. We have the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, which has aggressively prosecuted this war here in Canada. And I know that there are, for a fact, many Ukrainians who are totally opposed to supporting this war. There are, Ukrainians who have come here historically have been part of the labor movement and many movements that have benefited Canada. And prior to, just the finishing point, I guess, prior to the invasion and the Maidan coup, the Canadian press was full of reports of neo-Nazi activity and far-right violence in Ukraine. And now that's all vanished. And so I guess my question is, when you say, how are we to persuade our government, short of a mass movement of Canadians, which I don't see at this point emerging, and I'm part of several peace organizations, I don't know how we penetrate these leaders. I don't really think they care about the ordinary Canadian. And I hate to be that cynical, but sadly, that's my experience. When I'm shut out, when I'm not heard by my MP, when I'm treated with utter contempt, and human rights, by the way, when I raise any human rights issue, unless it is an issue that the Canadian government cares about, for example, Canada's terrible record of mining activity in the southern hemisphere, they do not want to hear me. So sorry for being so long, but if you could address perhaps some of that.
No, I mean, all good points. I don't think there's a magic answer to your question about how to penetrate the wall. But it's not just your MP. There's almost unanimity within Parliament on this position. I mean, it's partly a solidarity with Ukraine issue.
Yes.
And there's a great deal of legitimacy there. I mean, there was an illegal invasion of Ukraine. However one wants to look at the extenuating circumstances and so on, that was a violation that should never have happened. It needs to be clearly and unequivocally condemned. And maybe that clears the way for then saying, okay, this was wrong. This should never have happened. Now what are we going to do? So we don't. There's porous discussion in much of this, which we didn't actually go into. But the point now, I think, is to find the cracks in the government sort of bold face, and see what might. That's one of the reasons I raised the Justin Trudeau one about. And this fits to some of your comments about the questions about democracy in Ukraine. The fact that he raised that, so that's a sign. Maybe now is the time that we might have an opportunity. we need to not focus on certain elements and get back to ending the bloodshed. Now there's going to be particularly on the Ukrainian side, I would say, and including some Ukrainian Canadians, serious concerns about what has happened to their people and grievances that have, resurfaced or have been created anew from the invasion. And these should not be denied. I mean, we have to accept but we have to move on, I think, is the point. We have to move on to, yes, we know this is happening, but the war will eventually end. We know that wars always end. How much bloodshed has to be spilled before we get to the ceasefire, and that's the focus. I think there's some opportunities, even though they're slim.
Thank you.
Stephen Crozier, you have your hand up. Please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, hi, thank you, and thanks for the information. It's very helpful. Thank you, Greg, for your questions, because I think we're all up against that when we're talking to our governments. Well, I guess this is, whoops, sorry, I'm out on the balcony here, so I hope the sound from the street isn't too bad. I think, and I was interesting that we brought up the environmental crisis was also brought up. I often say that if there was more money in peace than in war, and if there was more money in protecting the environment than destroying it, we would not be in this situation. And I wonder if someone could sort of comment on that, because I really think that that's what we're up against. We are up against the American military-industrial complex. Canada, being the little sister of the US, is right on board. And there are certainly deterrents from using nuclear weapons for sure, because of the ultimate destruction. But the continuation of the war is really, I would say, based as much on finances as anything else.
Yeah, this is one of those chicken and egg ones too. I mean, do the finances drive the policy, or do the policies make demands for militarization for security? It is a security question, and you could take. I mean, you mentioned a few crises. You could take these crises, and we could sit down and in 15 minutes we can come up with better policies that would have prevented these crises. Like even in Ukraine, there's a whole slew of things that could have happened, and I would draw attention to the Minsk Accords in particular. If these were implemented, my guess, there would not have been a war. And even now, at the end of this war, we're going to be going back to something close to, although some make the point that certain people may not want to live with each other anymore. They may want full separation, and that is an additional problem now to be addressed. But all of the issues that drove this war were preventable or were resolvable. There's no question about that. And so I don't see a conspiracy here, but I see real stupidity. There's power politics for sure, where there's certain powers that did not get involved or make concessions where there wouldn't, pre-bloodshed or consideration. Like, forget about concessions. I mean, we get accused of being appeasers now because we think we need a ceasefire, and we call for the blood to be stopped, because that means that we are conceding the invasion to Putin, which we aren't. But a ceasefire is the first step to begin the negotiations. It's not the negotiations. What can be resolved better by destruction, knowing that these are two countries that live together side by side, will have to continue to live together side by side, that are now killing each other, What benefit down the road after the war is over would increasing bloodshed bring? It is incomprehensible that some would think in those terms. Is money calling the shots? I don't think so entirely. I think it's policy. You can shift money if the political will is there, but the point is the political will isn't there. The population isn't driving the political will. They're not in the streets, as the fellow mentioned. He's getting roadblocks from his MP. They're not listening. They might be listening, but they don't want to speak. That is more likely. But all of this stuff is not unusual, right? And my feeling is that it's not as solid. It's not entrenched in cement like people think it is. It could be on the cusp of changing. Look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. It looked like the gig was up, and then all of a sudden it all switched in whatever it was, 30 days, 60 days, whatever it was. Things can move fast. What can't move fast is the shift to common security that requires, completely different jobs, completely different ways of farming and dealing with climate and energy sources and so on and so on. This takes time, but we have to get at it right after, or even now during this war.
Well, I think that one of the things that I keep saying is that, to my mind, there is no military solution to this problem, and the ongoing refrain, and Mr. Trudeau once again and several others have stated similar things, that, well, we have to keep going because it puts the Ukrainians into a better bargaining position once negotiations start. Well, what's the use of that? The outcome still has to, in some way, shape, or form, reflect some realities, and the basic realities are that the borders, whatever are established, have to, in some ways, reflect the preferences of those that have to live within them, and that's not going to be achieved by military means. That's got to be achieved by sitting down and saying, okay, what are reasonable borders? What are reasonable ways that we can live side by side with one another? And carrying on the war doesn't get us any closer to that.
Yeah. And there's a democracy issue here too. In a fully democratic society or societies, grievances that are based on language or ethnicity or whatever can be resolved democratically, so that they don't break out into internecine wars or civil wars. And borders can reflect those realities. Like, you don't have statelets wanting to separate or move away from one state, or people within those statelets wanting to move away if they feel that their grievances are being addressed in a democratic way. One of the worst things that happened in Ukraine early on was the language rules that were being implemented against the Russian minority. This was the stupidest thing that could ever have been done. It was driven by ultra-nationalists within Ukraine that were anti-Russian or Russian speakers. The Minsk Accords, in part, were to try and resolve that conflict. It could have been done. Not every state was supporting those accords. The Germans and the French were. So those who say, that NATO was all behind this and running the ship, well, no, the Germans and the French were not behind.
Let's not forget that Zelensky was elected on the platform of.
That's right. Originally, he was. That's right. And now, of course, there's the ultranationalist problem that he is absorbed in, that is pushing him in a certain direction. So. So the democracy aspect shouldn't be forgotten. And again, I raised that Justin Trudeau raised this the other day when he was in Ukraine, which is interesting. That's a good sign that Global Affairs Canada is thinking outside the old box anyway.
Well, thank you for your very informative and very thoughtful answers to all of the questions, Robin. And Thank you for all of those that have participated and come forward with very good questions. I think at this point is probably a good time to bring things to a close. Thank you all for attending, I think it has been a very worthwhile and a fruitful exchange of opinions. My gratitude to you all.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye, everyone.